There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on.
Good evening. Emergency services responding to a fire have found a mother of four murdered in her Warnbro home.
A mum of one has been found dead inside her own home, allegedly murdered by her ex-boyfriend.
How dare you? How dare you go into politics in an environment like this when one woman is murdered every 4 days?
Hopes action may finally be taken to prevent the deaths of women in domestic violence attacks. The Prime Minister calling an emergency national cabinet meeting as tens of thousands marched across the country.
Stay, stop! We won't take it anymore! 5, 6, 7, 8! No more violence, no more hate!
We need to acknowledge that we need to change behaviour, we need to change attitudes, we need to change culture.
This month, we're doing things a little bit differently here on True Crime Conversations. I'm Gemma, your host, and I want to talk to you about men's violence against women. Because right now, it's so alarming and so terrifying, the rate at which we are losing women, that it's pertinent that we do everything we can to progress this conversation towards actual change in our country. This week is the start of Domestic and Family Violence Prevention Month. It's only May, and by the end of April, 34 women had been murdered in Australia in 2024 alone. Of course, all of these deaths weren't domestic. 5 women died recently at the Bondi Westfield stabbing attack in Sydney. We know the attacker didn't know them personally, but we know he targeted women when he started stabbing people on a Saturday afternoon. But most female deaths at the hands of men are domestic. On April 22nd, 28-year-old childcare professional and mum of one, Molly Ticehurst, was killed in her Forbes home in New South Wales. Her former partner, who had recently been bailed for an assault on Molly, has been charged with her murder. On April 14th, 67-year-old palliative care volunteer and mum of 4, Leslie Stillman, was murdered by her former partner in her Carramar home in Western Australia. He killed himself too, but not before leaving a note which read, "Won't get justice, will die with her." On April 5, the body of 23-year-old Hannah Maguire was found in a burnt-out car in Scarsdale, Victoria. Her former partner has been charged with murder. A domestic violence order had recently been placed against him. Fed up with the horrific stories of women's lives being cut short, 100,000 people, men, women and children, marched the streets in 17 towns and cities across the country last weekend.
Say it once, say it again! There's no excuse for violent men!
It is exhausting. We are exhausted. 27% of women in this country have experienced violence or abuse at the hands of a partner. The numbers and the reality are so much higher.
They demanded more to be done to stop the violence. Our government has a 10-year plan, but what about today? Tomorrow? Next week? How many women do we have to lose before that plan comes to fruition? This month on True Crime Conversations, we're revisiting stories from our archives to highlight crimes involving male violence against women in our country. Stories that should have been the case that stopped the country and forced change. Stories that are shocking to relive, but important to understand. But before we get to that, we wanted to talk to someone who lives and breathes violence against women every single day. Sherele Moody is a journalist, an Our Watch fellow, and the founder of the Red Heart campaign and the Australian Femicide Watch. She has created a moving and chilling memorial online that tracks every known Australian woman and child killed as a result of murder, manslaughter or neglect from white settlement to now. Visually, that looks like dozens upon dozens of hearts on a page. Big hearts for women, little hearts for kids. Every image tells you a different, heartbreaking story with the hover of your mouse. Sherele joins us now to talk about her work, the state of the world, and what we can actually do to see change. I want to start with your own story because you are no stranger to violence in your own life and family. Can you tell us about that as much as you feel comfortable sharing?
Absolutely. When I was about 14 or 15 years old, my mum married a guy up in Queensland, and we knew very little about him. After they married, he told us that he'd been in jail for manslaughter and that he had king-hit a man and the man died. About 3 or 4 years later, out at Roma, a little girl went missing. She was 9 years old and her name was Stacey Ann Tracy. The man that my mother married, my stepfather, was the person who abducted, raped and murdered her. Very early in the police investigations, when they first spoke to me, I think it was about 24 hours, maybe 48 hours after Stacey Ann had disappeared, and they told me my stepfather's background and that, in fact, he hadn't killed a man. He had raped, abducted and murdered another little girl some 20 or so years previously. He spent time in jail, obviously, for the murder of Sandra Bacon, who he killed in Townsville. He was released with support of a Christian community who lobbied for his parole. He met my mother, he married, and consequently they moved to Roma. And he came across Stacey Ann the day before he killed her. She was visiting a friend at the units that my mother and stepfather lived in. And the next day he saw her, he followed her as she dropped her little sister to school and then picked her up and took her before she was able to safely arrive at her own school. And within a couple of hours, she was dead.
How old were you when you found this out?
Oh, gosh, I was 19. Yeah, so I pretty much knew when the police came and knocked on the door and said they had a warrant. There was obviously a sinking feeling. We knew a child had gone missing, and in fact, he had talked about the child being missing, and he was a SES volunteer, so a state emergency volunteer. He actually attended one of the searches for her, as he had done with Sandra when he killed her. So when the police knocked on the door with that warrant, there was definitely a knowledge that something was amiss and that someone in our household had done something to her, and that quickly became evident as the police were searching the house and speaking to us and speaking to him privately.
What kind of effect did something like that have on your formative years? You're only 19 when you find that out, on your young adulthood.
Oh my gosh. I spent a lot of time being angry about this. You can't have something like that happen and not feel a real level of guilt, a real level of anger, a real level of sadness. And it was something that sat with me for a very long time. And then about 8 or 9 years ago, I started the Red Heart campaign off the back of doing a fairly big domestic violence campaign as part of my employment in the media industry back in the day. And the Red Heart campaign came from that. And I just really felt like that was a space to put my anger into. And you can't turn something like this into a positive. You just can't do that. But to turn it into something useful and something that makes change for other people's lives and perhaps makes up in some small way for Stacey's family and for Sandra's family.
Going back to the start of the creation of Red Hearts, how did you come up with this idea? Because obviously in this space, you would have been trying to think of something to actually make people stop and listen. How did you end up on this idea?
So initially it started as the idea was that people would share a heart if they were impacted by violence, in particular domestic violence. And after a while I became extremely aware from conversations I was having with women that women were being impacted by violence outside of the domestic and intimate partner sphere. So people were suffering sexual violence or physical violence at the hands of people who weren't not always their families. So, maybe neighbours, friends, colleagues, and sometimes strangers. And then I kind of thought there's no real documentation of lives lost in Australia. There's no memorial for lives lost. There's no online database where you can look up people who have been murdered. And so I started with obviously Stacey and Sandra. They were the first two people that I added to, I guess, the Femicide Watch, as it is now known. And since then, I've just been adding women and children as they are killed, and also women and children who were killed in previous years, so going back to white settlement in Australia.
Sherele, that is a huge task because
yes, massive.
It's not like a few women die. We're talking hundreds, we're talking thousands. How much time have you spent on this?
A lot. Some weeks I might spend 10 hours. The thing is that you can't just add them. In terms of adding current deaths, obviously cases are still going through the court process and there are cases going through the coronial process. And so those need to be completely updated as they happen. I need to do updates at least once a year. So backtrack and check every case that's there and make sure that it's up to date in terms of the courts or coronial. So it's not just adding new deaths and it's not just adding historical deaths, it's the constant updating as well.
How much of your personal and professional time do you spend doing this? Are you getting messages through at, 3 a.m. in the morning? Are you doing it in the middle of a dinner with your partner?
Basically, this is how my day operates. I get up. The first thing I do is I check my messages and then I check police media releases and then I check a news site. So that's a good half-hour coffee doing that. I go for a run. I'll come back, I'll have breakfast, and I'll just really go through more news websites and follow up any tips that I've had. I work with Canva to do the She Matters posts, so they just take a couple of minutes. If a woman's been killed and I've got information, I might spend an hour writing a post and sending that out. I try to spend about 2 or 3 hours a week at a minimum updating the memorial with the current deaths and following up any court conclusions that might have come through. But yeah, look, an average week, it depends. At the moment, I'm off work, and so half of my time is dedicated to that. It's a minimum of 2 hours a day, which doesn't sound like much, but I'm constantly checking. So I'm not just checking in the morning, I'll check in the middle of the day and later in the afternoon. And then sometimes I'll be like about to go to bed and there's the media release or there's the headline, and it's, you have to stay up and do the posts and be alert and be monitoring and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a massive gig, and sometimes it really feels overwhelming, especially when we have so many deaths in such a short period of time.
I feel like sometimes you're the first person posting. It seems like you know about these deaths before a lot of people in Australia do. How are you finding out? Is it family reaching out to you? Who's telling you?
I consider myself to be really lucky. I have excellent contacts in police across the country, and that's just something that I've built up as a journalist over many years, and also because a lot of police seem to have an admiration for the work that we're doing and understand the need for it in this space. And families are really vital to this research and very important. And often I also get information from community members and friends of victims and stuff like that. We do have some situations where deaths are not reported publicly by police. For instance, that's quite common in Western Australia. There's one case at the moment that I'm trying to get information on where an Indigenous woman was killed in the past 2 weeks in a house fire, much like Erica Hay, but definitely not her, in a remote region. And the police are just not giving me the information I need to be able to add her and track her. But her family have given me the background. And so I'm sort of stuck in this loop where I know it's happened, but it's hard to kind of add until I have that sort of official.
And over the process of doing what you do you build relationships with families and stay in touch with them?
Oh my God, yeah. That first conversation with them is really hard, but I have so many friends as a result of this work. So particularly parents and siblings of women who've been murdered. And it just, sometimes I can't remember all their names, but they're the kind of people that you check in every now and then, or they check in on you. And the friendship circle is very big because of this job.
Do you feel like you're in a unique position because you have had violence touch your own family, that you are able to connect with these people?
Yeah, coming from that different angle of being the relative of a killer, it's kind of a weird angle to come in from, but I know Stacey Ann's family I know really well, and I have a really strong friendship with them, and I've learnt a lot from them about how murder impacts a person's life, and I'm able to take those learnings and use them to inform how I interact with other families. Yeah, if it hadn't have been for this situation, I would never have been able to do this ethically or morally in a way that sits well.
What has the response been like to this project?
Mainly it's positive. I would say 95% of the response is positive, but of course there is that 5% of people who feel like by focusing on women and children, unnecessarily maligning men, or I'm deliberately choosing not to add them because I don't care. And both of those things are as far from the truth as you can get.
You and I know why that is not true, but for those listening, we do have a lot of male listeners. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, look, on an average year, you would expect to add 52 women and 1 child per month. So on average, so 12 children. So that's a lot of deaths. We know that around 4 times the number of men are killed. I'm one person, I just don't have the resources for it. I don't have the mental fortitude to take on that level of relentless violence. I just can't do it.
And it's also, correct me if I'm wrong, but violence against women is such an important thing to highlight because most of the people that are being killed, men or women, are being killed by men.
Absolutely. I've always said this. If we can end or reduce violence against women, we automatically reduce violence against men because the main perpetrators in the country are male. And the main drivers and factors also underpin those deaths in many ways, especially the domestic violence deaths, that sense of ownership, that sense of control, that sense of toxicity, they're all still there in male deaths. If we can eliminate violence against women, we will save many, many male lives. And a lot of people don't realise that.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with journalist Sherele Moody about Australia's epidemic of violence against women. You have to do a new heart every few days, really, especially at the moment.
We're 30 days into April and I've done 12 new hearts plus 2 children. So actually I've done 14 hearts, so 12 women and 2 children. Obviously, these statistics are much higher this year due to Bondi Junction.
Mm-hmm.
But if we take those deaths out, we are still tracking higher than previous years at this stage.
How do you mentally deal with this? Because that's a lot. It's a lot to take on.
You just do it. Look, any kind of emotional or mental fatigue, I feel, is nothing compared to the impact on their families and their loved ones and their communities. It is absolutely nothing. And the reality is someone has to do it and someone has to do it properly. Like, we can't have a project like this eliminating women because they don't meet a certain criteria. For instance, I document Australian women killed overseas and I refuse to not add them because who am I to say to their family that because your person was killed overseas, they're not relevant to us? Of course they're relevant. So we need to be really aware of that. And also in the case of murder-suicide, if there's strong confirmation from the family that a woman has been killed by her partner, then I'm adding her. I'm not saying to them, look, you're lying to me. That's not a conversation I'm going to have with them. The reality is that a murder-suicide is still the erasure of a woman.
What are the similarities in the stories that you see? One that comes to mind for me, is this a similarity that a lot of women are killed when they actually leave a relationship?
Oh, yeah, totally. So many times I've written for the memorial, she had only recently left her partner, or she was talking to him, she was going to see him to talk about future arrangements after having left, or she had indicated to someone that she was on the verge of leaving. Do you know what I mean? Like it is a really common theme, obviously in the intimate partner violence deaths, that are either on the verge of leaving or having left.
Are there any other similarities like that you've noticed, trends over time?
There's almost always an act of violence or coercive control beforehand, for sure. There are always people who say, we knew this was going to happen. And one of the common themes is families saying, look, we had no idea that this was ever going to happen. The other significant person in this never showed any acts of violence. But if you sort of pull away the layers, you can see the acts of coercion. So it might be financial control, emotional control, just the basics.
What about AVOs or DVOs?
Yeah, so DVOs and AVOs can often be present in the intimate partner violence deaths particularly. In some cases, there have been AVOs and DVOs where a child has killed their mother or grandmother. Not as common, but definitely there.
As well as being the host of this podcast, I am a writer and an editor here at Mamamia. And so I talk about violence against women in my day-to-day a lot. And I find December the hardest month when it comes to this topic because it's the time when you reflect back, you see how many deaths there have been this year, you compare it to the years past, and I think it's the sheer number of stories by that point and the fact that you know that the count is about to reset. What's your relationship with knowing that the year is about to start again and that we're going to be doing the same thing again?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously I've got a count. I've got an offline database with all of the information there. So it's something that I see every day. But one of the things I do find about hitting December is the emotional exhaustion is pretty heavy. And it always feels like there's not much of a reprieve between the end of December and the start of January. It is pretty fast. And I think the other thing is, like, when we reset the count, I feel like in many ways we're kind of saying that the discussion about the women killed last year is over. It's kind of a hard one. Like, you want to reset the count. You want to keep that discussion going, but also have this discussion over here. And yeah, it's kind of hard for that to sit comfortably with me because I don't want people to think that their person has been forgotten simply because of the year that they were killed in.
But I guess that also highlights just how many women we're losing, how many women and children we're losing, that we are having to keep going through the stories because we can't keep up. There's so many.
I hadn't looked at last year's figures for a while. And obviously, as I said, I'm updating deaths as I find them, but I hadn't actually gone back and did a count for last year. I had a media request this morning about Indigenous women and I checked last year's numbers and I was totally not expecting this, but my research shows that we lost 75 women last year.
That's much higher.
75.
That's insane.
That's not the children, right? So because there is a portion of deaths, say 10%, that we won't know about for weeks and months, and we may not know about until today, sort of due to charges or whatever. But yeah, like I was like, oh, fuck, that was a huge year. That was more than I expected.
Why? Why last year?
Why the year before or the year before that? You know, why this year?
There's no rhyme or reason, is there?
No, but I did notice that there has been research released showing that intimate partner violence deaths increased 30% last year. It makes sense that the database for last year is significantly high.
Are there any stories about women and children that have stayed with you in particular that you find floating back into your mind?
This is a really tough question to answer because, you know, there are ones that stand out, but then if I think harder, there are other ones that stand out. So, yeah.
I guess you've got a head full of so many stories.
Yeah, there are so many. There's so many. The ones that are particularly cruel and where the level of violence is just beyond comprehension. And also the ones where children witness their mums being killed. To tell you the truth, one that comes to mind when I think about this is a woman was killed here in Melbourne. The husband ripped her eyes out in front of her children and flushed them down the toilet.
Oh, my God. I don't even remember hearing about that.
The victim is not identified to protect the identity of the children and their futures. And the man, the level of cruelty and that killing was beyond, like, it's the kind of stuff that you don't expect to see in the worst horror movies. But the things he did to her in front of those children, yeah, I just can't even imagine how these kids are growing up and being mentally okay. I just can't imagine that.
What a horrendous thing for a human to do to another human.
I know, right? And do you know what? The amazing thing is that story barely made a ripple.
Why?
I think when she was first murdered, no one knew about it, and then it went through trial, and that's when the cruelty that he subjected her came out. I don't recall it making very big headlines. It may have just been missed by the media. But one of the other things was she was a woman from a non-English speaking background. And I do find a very recurrent theme in, I guess, media responses to dead women. The more diverse their background, the less headlines they get. So, yeah, the less media coverage. And it's really hard to say that as a journalist because it's saying that my industry is letting women down. But for sure, if you're white and pretty, you'll get a lot of media attention. If you're ethnic, say Filipino or Muslim, and you don't speak English and your name is hard to pronounce and you have brown skin, and it doesn't happen much at all for them.
I do think it is worth interrogating our own industry here because how else is it going to change unless we talk about it? Have you seen any improvement in that space or in how we report against violence against women and children?
Yeah, look, I've been a journo for about 27, 28 years, and one of the first jobs that I ever did, I was a cadet at the Toowoomba Chronicle in Queensland, and I was required to cover Magistrates Court on this particular day, and I went along, and a man was being sentenced for a very brutal bashing of his partner. And he walked from jail. He didn't go to jail. He didn't get a sentence. I think it was a no conviction and a bond of good order. I went back and said to my chief of staff, mate, this guy nearly killed this woman and he didn't go to jail. Can this be a story? And the chief of staff tried to talk me out of it. It's a domestic, no one's interested. And I'm like, but mate, he's done this to this woman and there was no sentence. Like, he's literally walked out. We've got to do something. That's what the attitude was like when I started. I remember another time I was sent to cover a horse racing in a small town called Dalby, which is out past Brisbane. I did the stuff that I had to do, and then I got talking to the female jockeys, and they were telling me about the sexual harassment they endured in this industry. It was pretty shit. I went back to the same chief of staff and said to him, you know, we got an issue here. These women are being raped, they're being assaulted, they're just doing their jobs. Didn't want a bar of it. So that's how it was when I entered the industry. Now, at least we are seeing media cover our deaths, and we're at least seeing a few paragraphs when a woman is killed. So they're doing the basics. So we have come a long way, and yet only a short way, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And also I think the rise of women's media like Mamamia, Women's Agenda, outlets where there is a real focus on women. It's more than just beauty and health and that sort of stuff. I feel like that's actually contributing to this and making it a lot better and setting a standard.
I want to talk to you about promises. The government loves promises. They have a 10-year plan that they're rolling out to try and fix this issue. And we do see little wins. We see things like the DV payments recently that have been announced, or the fact that coercive control has been criminalised in Queensland. But what's your assessment on the government's efforts currently towards this issue?
My assessment is that violence against women is an exceedingly complex yet simple problem. We know what the main drivers are for violence against women. We also know that there are many, many things that are needed, that need funding: refuges, housing, economic assistance, so many things. We have some safety nets, but those safety nets have holes in them. So, for instance, if you have an ethnic woman needing support, so say she's from a small ethnic community in Melbourne, say, I don't know, the Filipino community, right?
Yep.
She calls 1-800-RESPECT. She can't speak English. They get her a translator. The translator is from that community and knows her family. So do you know what I mean?
Yep.
So there's this communication. The translator can pass that information on to her family against her wishes. She may not want to speak simply because she doesn't want other people to know, or she fears the translator will tell her husband. So do you see what I mean? Like that is one small hole in the safety net. This woman is not going to reach out for help if she fears that someone from her community is going to know and put her at risk.
I feel like that's why it feels so overwhelming as to say, like, well, how do we change it? Because throwing money at it just isn't going to help. It's about fixing the holes, as you say. And how on earth do we do that?
I mean, you have a woman in a wheelchair and minimal refuge spaces for women with disability. If she can't navigate a refuge where there is a bed available, she's not going to get safety. She can't get safety if there's no lift to get her in and out. Do you know what I mean? There is so many holes, and we see them all the time, every day. And this is just the domestic and family violence part of this. We are not talking about associate violence and stranger violence. And to be fair, stranger violence is exceedingly rare in terms of deaths of women in Australia, but we have seen a big spike this year, and we do lose a couple of women to stranger violence. After intimate partner violence and domestic violence, the next context of deaths of women is associate violence. So women who are being killed by their colleagues, their neighbours, their friends, the friend of a friend of a friend, someone they know, but they're not in a relationship with and they're not familial. First, how do we count these women? Are these women being counted? In most cases, not being counted. What supports do we have for them? So take the case of Celeste Mano, who was killed by her colleague. She spoke to him once as she was helping him out the door after he lost his job. He became obsessed. He stalked her. He broke into her house. He killed her in her own bed. Police did what they could, but there were no other supports here for Celeste and her family. The government doesn't allow tracking of offenders, of fixated offenders. So this is another hole. If you don't have supports for women being killed outside of this context, outside of this narrow domestic and family violence context, we're still going to see many women killed. We need to be able to address that. We need to count it. We need to support it, and we need to examine it.
I feel like before we even get to the holes, there is another elephant in the room, which I know that you have a lot to say on, which is this undercurrent in society on how men think about women.
Oh, yeah, totally.
How on earth do we change the way society thinks, though?
Oh, my God, it is such a big problem. And as I keep saying, the only people who can make this change are men, because gendered violence is a man's problem. It's not a woman's problem to fix. We women work to pick up the pieces. We work to fix it because we're the only ones that have the drive to. It's always been something that women work to solve, that we work to aid, that we work to house. You know, we've always done that. It feels like it's always been a burden for us to fix, and we can't make this change without men, and we really need them to be at the forefront of this. We can't force them to think differently or behave differently. Nothing we as women do will influence that. We've tried being kind. We've tried, using honey instead of vinegar. We've tried yelling. We've tried rallies. We've tried begging, and it doesn't work. The only people who can fix it are men. And it's really awesome that we see men like Tarang Chawla stepping up and really being vocal and sort of pushing against all of the hate and really encouraging men. But if we don't get more men like him standing up, it's not going to work. Like, it is literally a man's problem, and we women don't have the solution for it. We can't do it.
Part of me thinks it's going to be generational. I became a mother last year to a son.
Yeah.
And I am taking that really seriously. I plan on raising my son to become a good feminist man. And part of me is like, is that how we change this? By raising good men to take the place of the bad ones? Am I being a bit hyperbolic there?
No, I don't think so. I think that that's always been a discussion that women have been having, wanting to raise sons who are good people and who are feminist allies and who are women allies and who just treat women with basic respect, treat other people with basic respect. The thing is, if we're going to rely on that change, we need all women doing it. And again, it comes down to women making the change.
That's the thing.
Shocking, right?
I know.
Dads need to be part of this process as well. My God, dads are dads. They're a parent. They're not a babysitter. They need to be part of this. They need to influence, and kids look up to their dads and they mimic their dads. But as long as we also have people like Andrew Tate being platformed, you know, those kind of people, young men who might be a bit disenfranchised or, you know, just not quite comfortable with where they're at or looking for a hero or looking for someone who speaks to them, as long as they're turning to people like this and as long as there are people like this with big media platforms and, you know, big voices, it's really a struggle because the dynamic that good parents are passing on to their kids can be erased by that other dynamic in the schoolyard, on social media, at the pub. It's like a clash of cultures in a way. But as I always say, you know, if men can be the change makers, we have a lot more hope of success. If men can drown out the voices of Andrew Tate with positivity,
that's the way forward.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have the answer.
How do you feel, because this month is Domestic and Family Violence Prevention Month. We've got a lot of these kinds of days and months that kind of go throughout the year. How do you feel about this? Because it's come at a very strange time. We're rallying on the streets. We're having an unprecedented number of women dying. And it kind of feels like the month comes around and you're like, well, we have this every year, but is it actually doing anything?
Not changing.
Yeah.
I say this for the 16 days against gendered violence as well later in the year. Every day should be a day for the end of domestic and family violence, for the end of violence against women, for the end of gendered violence. This is a thing that we need to work on every day. We cannot compartmentalise it to 4 weeks or 16 days or 1 day. It needs to be something that is forefront on many minds every day. Policy makers, government, community leaders, men, women, you know, we just all need to be working on this every day.
Do you think it's still important to have these moments, though, for the people that aren't thinking about this every day? Because a lot of people don't, that it's not front of mind, but having something like a DV Awareness Day, having that ad on the TV or having that interview on the radio, like surely it's better to have these days and months than not have them?
We need to take what we can get, right?
Yeah.
We've got to take what we can get. And also during Family Violence Month, there are a lot of memorials held, and that's a really important thing for people who've lost a loved one and people impacted by abuse. So that is really important, and I would never, ever take away from that. But if we were able to normalise this as an everyday conversation, especially in the media, if it was a normal part of our conversation, a part of our media process, then we could extend the change throughout the year and hopefully have a bigger impact. So, yeah, we should always be able to have the special days and the special months for focus and remembering and, you know, calls for change. But also let's have these conversations outside of those days as well.
I want to just pick on something that you mentioned earlier. You said that we all know the drivers behind violence against women and children. For those that might not be aware of them, can you take us through them? What are the main drivers?
So the main drivers are things like the way that men speak about women, demeaning them, putting them into a really tight kind of role, like as a mother or wife. There's the ownership of women, there's the ownership of children. So not letting women and children be their own people and have their own lives and make their own decisions. We have things like, you know, the control factors, financial abuse and stuff like that. The drivers are really fairly basic, and then they're compacted by the factors. So we know that when people use drugs or alcohol, have gambling addictions, mental health problems, that they can be factors in violence against women and children. So drivers need societal change, factors need government change, I guess is the easiest way to put it. You do need funding to highlight drivers and raise awareness about them and push them, but it's actually an all of society change that's needed. So the way that all of society thinks about women, but most importantly, the way that men view women. Women are equals, children are equals, they're not objects. The factors, on the other hand, we need more money for mental health services. We need, obviously, more money for everything. We need better bail laws. We need better criminal legislation. There's so much. So there's the tangible and the intangible.
I'm curious to get your take, because I feel like I always need a snappy answer to this.
Oh, God.
You might have one.
Probably not.
Not all men What do you say to that? It's not all men. I'm sure you've had it said to you before.
Oh, never. My answer to that is most definitely not all men, but almost always a man. I don't think it can be any clearer than that.
Do you think we will see tangible change in our lifetimes when it comes to this issue?
I think we'll see more younger men stepping up and being more aware of what's going on and being more respectful and kind and that sort of stuff. I think we'll see a lot more women being angry, but do I think that this is going to end in my lifetime? It won't. I'm 53 and things are much the same as they were when I was 3, so not a lot has changed.
I know that this is not a topic that has a lot of hope, but I'm trying to grasp at it. Where do listeners go from here? What can they actually do today to help?
They can reach out to organisations, see if organisations need support, volunteers, funding. They can get involved. There's a lot of organisations running petitions at the moment, so sign a petition if it speaks to your heart. Join a rally, start a social media campaign, speak to your mates, check in on the women in your life, make sure they're okay. Work with children in terms of respect and kindness and stuff like that. I don't think that anyone should give up hope, but I think that we need to be realistic and that we need to really work towards finding preventions and support services and funding to at least try to save some lives.
And Sherele, do you think you will ever stop counting?
I don't plan on yet. No, I consider it's a long-term thing. So, no, I think it'll be going on for a few years yet.
Thank you for all of the work you've been doing there. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate that too.
Thanks to Sherele for joining us on today's episode. You can find a link to her Red Hearts campaign and the Australian Femicide Watch in our show notes. Stay with us this month as we revisit stories from our archives, highlighting some of Australia's most shocking cases of domestic and family violence. And if this episode has brought up anything for you, or you just feel like you need to speak to someone, please call 1-800-RESPECT, 1-800-737-732. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Moylan. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week.